Welcome back. Now, the unemployment rate has decreased to 32.1% in the third quarter of 2024, and that's down from 33.5% from the previous quarter. And despite the slight decline, the country's unemployment rate remains stubbornly high, with 8 million people unemployed. And released by Statistics South Africa yesterday, the labour figures also indicate a decrease in employment in the finance, private households and manufacturing sectors. So to talk to us more about these latest figures and what the latest labour statistics actually mean for our economy and the country as a whole, we joined virtually now by Dawie Roodt, Chief Economist at the Efficient Group. Dawie, good morning. Always good to have you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you.
Now, the official unemployment rate, as was indicated in that intro, decreasing to 32.1% in the third quarter of 2024 and down from 33.5% in the previous quarter. What are we to read into this, Dawie? Let me put it that way.
Okay, well, you did mention that it's still extremely high. It's totally unacceptably high in South Africa if you look at the narrow or the broader definition of unemployment. But there was a bit of an improvement, and of course, every improvement is something that we all should be very, very happy about. A bit of an improvement there. If you analyze the numbers, you will see the improvement or the job creation is actually happening in the informal sector, which is not a bad thing, but it would have been better if the job creation was actually happening in the formal sector for various reasons. The kind of jobs that were created, I don't know if you've mentioned that, but the kind of jobs that were created, some of that is good news. Some job creation in the construction industry, which is a good thing, of course, as well. But some unfortunate numbers is that there was a reduction in the number of people employed in the financial sector. So all in all, not much of a change. Remember, these figures are not seasonally adjusted. They are actually, let's call it the raw numbers. They are not adjusted for certain things like seasonalities and so on. So these are raw numbers, and it basically tells us that we haven't really made any much progress. But I do think that there are a couple of silver linings that we have to point out as well. One is that sentiment in the market improved markedly, especially after the new so-called government of national unity, which is actually a coalition government, but nevertheless, there was an improvement. We also saw the financial markets improving quite nicely. That is likely to spill over in slightly better economic growth. We saw the appointment of a number of new ministers, a number of new brooms, that are clearly sweeping a little bit clearer or cleaner than the previous ministers in those portfolios. Those are all good news stories. Unfortunately, this is unlikely to really lift economic growth in South Africa a lot. I still think economic growth is likely stuck around 1% or just above 1% or so. In fact, Treasury expects economic growth of about 1.1%. And keep in mind that then a couple of 100,000 new entrants enter the job market every year. And we need to grow the economy at 4, 5, 6% before we can really reduce unemployment significantly in South Africa. But yes, there are some good news stories, but of course, there's a long, long way ahead of us before we can make a significant reduction in unemployment.
And of course, you know, speaking of economic growth, Dawie, I think that's worth spending a bit of time on, because you spoke about where the jobs actually were created in the informal sector. You look at the formal sector, and I suppose part of the reason why you didn't see growth there was because of the sluggish economy that has been sitting at under 2% growth for over a decade now. And this is something, obviously, that needs to be addressed with some urgency, because, as you say, the population keeps growing, and yet we're stuck at around 1% growth. Yeah. And that's not a recipe for success.
Yeah, just keep in mind, you know, this is not a one-to-one thing. What I mean, there are leads and lags in the economy. There are some improvements. We know, for example, electricity is doing much, much better. So we will see the benefits of that, I would guess, in the coming quarters. Again, not good enough, but there are some signs of an improvement. And then some other state-owned enterprises, like, for example, Transnet. I've got the impression that Transnet is much better run than previously. So they are an improvement in Transnet, and especially on the harbors. There seem to be some things happening. Of course, there are some bottlenecks here and there. So it's not a one-to-one thing always. But yes, we're not doing enough. We're not certainly not doing nearly enough to improve conditions for stronger economic growth in South Africa. And if you look at the coalition government or so-called government of national unity in South Africa, and you compare it to the previous government, there are some improvements, and I did highlight some of those, but fundamentally or ideologically, it is still basically the same government. And that is really the choking point for South Africa. We need to change the way that we look at the economy. We have to move away from the socialist ideas or the centralization of everything and government can do everything to giving the private sector more opportunity. And there are examples of that. Where the private sector is getting involved in electricity, as an example, we don't have load shedding anymore. Where the private sector is hopefully get more involved in Transnet, there will be improvement in logistics, for example, in South Africa. So we need more private sector participation, but unfortunately, ideologically, government is pretty much opposed to that. But there are signs of improvements.
So we look at the number of people not economically active, including discouraged job seekers, Dawie, that figure standing at 16.5 million. Obviously, that's worrying. You look at some of the contributing factors to the stubborn high unemployment rate. You look at the skills mismatch as an example. You look at youth unemployment that is disproportionately high. So again, structurally, how do we start addressing these matters?
Well, yeah, let me just give you a couple of other numbers. We've got 12 million people that's supposed to work in South Africa that's not working. We've got today in South Africa 30 million people that get an income from the state every month, because the various grants and, of course, the civil servants are also getting huge increases and huge salaries from the state. The number of taxpayers in South Africa, and we've spoken about that, the number of taxpayers in South Africa is an extremely narrow base, and now there's even talk of a further increase in things like, for example, a wealth tax. Now, if you increase taxes further on the productive side of the economy, you're simply going to kill the productive side even more than what you are doing currently. It is not only, and I'm trying to put the emphasis on economic growth, and that is certainly where the emphasis should be. But there are other things that we need to improve as well. If you look, for example, the difference between unemployment between people with degrees, people with post-matric qualifications and people without a matric, for example, there is a huge difference in unemployment between these two groups, which simply means that we've got a skills problem in South Africa. So we need to put more emphasis on skills development. But skills development, I don't mean we need more chemical engineers, for example. Of course, we need those as well. But we have to put the emphasis on primary education. If you compare South Africa's primary education to the rest of the world, because that's the basis of skills development. If you don't start off on a strong base to create skills further on, then you can't create all those chemical engineers and all those other people that we need in the economy. So the emphasis must be on primary education, and I'm afraid we're really falling very much short on primary education. But in the end, it is about economic growth. Even very lowly skilled people can get accommodated in the economy, even if we have strong economic growth, which we certainly do not have. And I did mention earlier, and this is something that we should be a little bit concerned about, and that the job creation is shifting more to the informal part of the economy, which means that the formal part of the economy is just not growing fast enough to accommodate more job entrants.
And speaking of skills and skills mismatch, employment in the private households also decreased, Dawie. So again, great concern, because again, people who don't necessarily have a skill set to offer to the market, we're seeing fewer employment opportunities there as well.
What that tells me, the number of fewer people in jobs and households, that tells me that the middle classes in South Africa are under pressure. The middle class, the income of the middle class is simply not keeping tread with the rising cost in the economy. And of course, what you do is that you likely employ somebody to assist you in your household. And if your income comes under pressure, especially for the middle class, then of course you will not employ that people anymore. So I think that is more a sign of the middle classes in South Africa being under pressure.
And coming back to your point about investment in education, well, South Africa does already spend, quite a significant part of its GDP on education. So what is going on there? And again, the solutions is what we ought to be focused on.
Yeah.
How do we fix this, Dawie? Because, we look at what we are getting, that, at the end of the schooling career, but Is it time to address the curriculum? Is it more money that's needed? Where should we actually be focusing to fix this problem?
Yeah, education is a very good example, but I think the bigger problem in South Africa is the civil service. The civil service, and you can compare all sort of numbers. If you compare how much civil servants are paid in South Africa, they are, broadly speaking, and I'm going to get into trouble again, but broadly speaking, they're hugely overpaid, and broadly speaking, they're hugely underworked compared to on just about any measurement, if you like to. In the case of education, that's a very good example. We have some of the, I would say, we have some of the best educators or teachers in the world. But let's be honest, we've got some seriously bad teachers in South Africa as well. The biggest expense item for the Minister of Finance is education. So it's not a matter of money. We spend huge amounts of money on education. If you compare the salaries of our teachers, absolutely, and relative terms to many other countries in the world, our teachers are very well remunerated. However, if you compare the outcome of education in South Africa, and again, it's primary education where the emphasis should be. If you compare the outcome of that, our education is not only bad, it is sometimes the worst in the world. So there must be something wrong here. The taxpayer pays a huge amount of money on education, and the bulk of that goes to salaries. But the outcome of education is horrible, and the result of all of that is that skills development in South Africa lags very well behind many other countries in the world, and the outcome of that is weak economic growth and high levels of unemployment. So education is something that I think we have to put a lot more emphasis on. And we just don't do that. The quality is just not good enough. But it's not only education, it is very much the broader civil service in South Africa. And we can see how civil servants keep on demanding very high increases in salaries. We get all these, for example, the parliamentary cleaners getting these huge increases now. That simply cannot be afforded. The South African taxpayer, the productive part of the economy, simply cannot afford this huge burden anymore. And I think education is just one of those examples, but there's a broader picture here, and that's the civil service.
And of course, Dawie, to be fair, in as much as you looking at what the civil servants at the bottom are earning, you've got a bloated cabinet that was increased in size. So, yes, that pretty much is a trickle-down effect. And the reality is that it's very difficult to make a change at the bottom if you can't make the change at the top. But also, I just quickly want to, before we go, touch on that youth unemployment again, because I think this is potentially one of the biggest ticking time bombs that we have. So you've got youth aged 15 to 24 years of age, and then your 25 to 34. Those brackets continue to have the highest unemployment rates at 60.2% and 40.4% respectively. Again, the long-term economic impact of this on South Africa's future.
Yeah, that is everybody wants a good job, and I understand that. Everybody wants a good job, and everybody should have a good job. But the best way of getting a good job is getting a job to start off with, because if you can't get into the job market, getting a good job is not possible. Everybody wants to walk into be in a senior position somewhere in a company, for example. That's not going to happen. You have to start at the bottom if you're a young individual. Unfortunately, there's a lot of legislation in South Africa preventing young people from getting a job. That is the most important thing. Not a good job, get a job. That's how you're going to get into the job market. And we have things like, for example, minimum wages in South Africa, making it extremely difficult for young people to get into the job market. We have spoken about skills development and a lack of the necessary skills in South Africa, but I also believe that there's a lot of other obstacles in the way of young people getting into the job market. And one certainly is minimum wages, but there are other issues as well. Labor in South Africa, perhaps we should talk about labor legislation. I think labor, generally speaking, is overprotected in South Africa. Labor is very well organized. Quite often organized labor is quite aggressive in South Africa. And remember that the clients of organized labor are people with jobs, not people without jobs. They don't care about people without jobs because those are not their clients. They are concerned about their members, and they have, by definition, they have jobs. So perhaps we need to look at labor legislation making it easier for those unemployed, especially young people, to get into the job market and start climbing the job ladder, because you need to get a job in order to get a good job.
I would love to have a further discussion on that. Dawie Roodt, let's leave it there for this morning. Thanks so much, Chief Economist of Efficient Group, talking to us about the latest statistics, South Africa employment figures for the third quarter of 2024 and how this impacts the economy.